Good morning, good evening, everyone. We have different time zones here. My name is Doaa Farid. I'm an award-winning broadcast journalist and podcast host. I speak to you from Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, and I'm so excited to be with you today in the events of Global Impact Forum. This year we have 100,000 attendees, over 300 speakers, and 150 sessions. So I'm so glad to be moderating this panel discussion about new trends and social impact of digital entertainment. Today I have John D. Canning, Director of Developer Relations and Creators at AMD, Arash Pendari, founder at Vionlabs, Oscar Hoagland, CEO at Epidemic Sound, and Joost van Dreunen, professor at New York University's Stern School of Business. He's also a writer and investor. Hello, everyone. We're
Hello.
going to talk about digital entertainment. This has been massively transformed in recent years, and it has changed how consumers and viewers interact with content, how artists and industry players engage, and even how producers and studios market their content. Of course, the pandemic has changed many things in our lives, including, for example, having more time for home entertainment. Our objective today is to share some of the thinking on this. So I'm gonna start with John D. Canning, Director of Developer Relations and Creators at AMD. Hi, John.
Hi, how you doing?
All good. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. Let's dig into it.
Great. Great. John, you've worked for years in creating and delivering media, games, immersive experiences to users and viewers. And as you see, digital technology has transformed the entertainment industry entirely now, and it continues to develop and mature furthermore. How do you see that on the content creation front and the consumption front?
Well, there's a lot packed into that. As I'm sure my other colleagues will marvel at the change of how we've created content and the tools we've used have really exploded and changed in a way that is, I think, fun in the sense of the traditional worlds of, say, video creation, traditional worlds of game creation are no longer traditional. They're mashed together. We see the ability to use tools that we thought about creating games with, creating content, video content. The notion of what content has changed, and the how consumers get it is just exploded in the number of ways. I often tell content creators how distribution is no longer your problem. Yeah, you may still need to make money. That's always a problem. But the how to get to the audience has just exploded. And there's so many options and so many different choices today.
Do you think the process became more difficult to reach the audience the way they need?
Um, More different. One
It
more
become
time.
more difficult. Has the process become more difficult to cater for the needs of audience or
I
the
think
viewers?
I think the process has become easier and the choices are broader. A number of us, are familiar with when there was one broadcaster in a country, or maybe only a handful of broadcasters. So if you were going to be on television, there was only certain channels to do that. And now you see the ability of, as we said, TikTok to Twitch to YouTube to broadcast to streaming, all of these different options. So it's almost the difficulty is picking which one you want to be on.
Yeah, that's the thing, because I was thinking back then consumers did not have much options. So they only have, for example, two channels to watch, but now they have, I think, thousands of different streamers and channels to watch. This is why maybe I think the process has been more difficult just to keep the audience on and active with you. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I think your bigger, yeah, the big challenge is finding an audience that meets your needs. Because now the audiences are so distributed, and you could say fickle. They quickly choose what they like and they don't like. They move around. So you've got that challenge, right? You can put content out there, but who will watch it? So building an audience, and if that building an audience for what reason? Is building an audience for fan base? Is it for clicks and likes to prove to a sponsor? Is it advertising? So again, maybe that going back to the how do you make money doing this can be the challenge. How do you stand out as a content creator? Because now that everybody can create content and distribute content, the competition for those eyeballs has really gone up.
Yeah. And that would take me to Arash Pendari, the founder and creative director at Vionlabs. Arash, 12 years ago, you saw that you have founded a company to enhance the user experience for TV and movies. And across the years, more tools kept emerging and developing, powered by artificial intelligence. So, from your experience with that, how did AI and deep learning techniques have transformed storytelling?
Well, I mean, it's so many different areas, but to kind of simplify it, I would like to say that it helped democratize content creation. I would say if you look at the tools that are available today for content creators, they can create very professional content with their mobiles and laptops. This was not possible before. Our mobiles have dedicated AI chips, so you can add something to the background or remove something, put special effects. And this is what I think is quite interesting. Then you have the other part where AI have helped storytelling, like companies like Netflix. They have been using AI for a long time in the part of content production to help produce. And this is for good or bad, I would say. I would say it's for the both sides, because I like to always say that AI plus humans creates magic, but AI by itself is not creative, right? And I think this can be an interesting discussion to take further. Netflix have more and more lost traction of their viewers. They have become maybe too data driven. They have maybe let AI drive too much of the storytelling, where a lot of the content becomes more and more similar. And this is where data driven kind of content production and having help of AI can be something that holds you back. But for the other side, a lot of small players are becoming bigger. So AI, I believe, can help remove more and more the power of having big studios being the only ones that produce the content that entertain us, to giving the power to the small content creators. And for the next 5 years, I think this will escalate quite quickly. So you won't see only Netflix and Warner Brothers making the amazing TV shows we watch. You will see smaller content creators on YouTube getting more and more higher quality productions, and on TikTok as well.
You mean individual content creators, right? Not
Yeah,
only
correct.
companies.
Yeah, exactly.
So at the moment, the AI techniques, is it being more used by companies or individuals? Because as you said, TikTok and Instagram are trying to use these techniques. Is it being used more often by users, not companies?
I mean, users do this to add color correction. They use it for AR effects, to add another layer on top of their video. AI in general have simplified tasks that was quite complex before, that took hours and a lot of knowledge and education. This was something the studios were setting on by themselves, and they had the professional studio. So yeah, I would say that that's what has been quite enabled right now, and will escalate the next couple of years.
Thank you, Arish. And I think since we mentioned TikTok and Instagram, and this all falls under the umbrella now of digital entertainment. So that cannot be done without music. So Oscar Hoagland, the CEO at Epidemic Sound, with us today. Oscar, you are enhancing the access to music for storytellers through a digital rights model. that is paving the way for digital creators to use music for their content. And we see short clips are now taking the scene in the digital world. I mean, digital platforms are now stacked with videos over short music clips. How's that changing the entertainment music industry, both economically and technically?
So, Doaa, I think a couple of things. I think that before I dive into that, I'd just love to reflect on like where we are currently in the world. I think that the last 10 years will go down as many things. I think they'll go down as years with a lot of climate anxiety. I think that they will go down as years with potentially global unrest throughout the world. There's been a pandemic ravaging the entire world as well. And I think that all these things are true. But at the same time, I also believe that the last 10 years will go down as maybe the golden age of storytelling, in the sense that I think that there's been more innovation as it relates to storytelling in the last 10 years than sort of in a very, very long time, I would argue, maybe since the printing press and Gutenberg did their thing. The fact that binge watching didn't sort of exist, and how we consume content, there used to be 15 minutes and then there were 15 minutes, so 15 hours, 15 minutes, 15 seconds. There's been such an explosion of content creation in general. So I'm quite optimistic about storytelling in particular. And I think the way that I think about it, and the way I'd love to phrase it here today, is that if I take a step out, I see that there are two big secular trends, which I find interesting to think about. And I see them almost as spectrums. So one goes from east to west and one goes from long to short. And you ask her about long to short. So let's start there. What I find to be super interesting is that there's this parallel massive experiment going on where we've seen short form content creation explode during the last couple of years. And let's use, John used TikTok as an example before, and I think that's an excellent example. So like very short form content has done incredibly well. At the same time, obviously, we've seen long form content do well also. Let's have YouTube illustrate that with 15 minutes plus. What's interesting is that we're now seeing a world where long goes short and short goes long. And so what we're seeing is that YouTube launches YouTube Shorts, so as a response, as to does Facebook in terms of Reels. So we're seeing the long form sort of producers experiment and try and go into the short form world because that's wildly interesting. But at the same time, the opposite is true, right? Because we're seeing TikTok go from 1 minute to 3 minutes to now extending into 10 minutes. So long is going short, short is going long, and they're both trying to experiment with each other's different sort of content sets. And I think it's interesting because they're coming from two different areas. I would argue that sort of technology has very much driven the short revolution in terms of AI recommendation, the user experience. That's been at the core of driving the innovation from a short form perspective. And I would argue that the long form has been more commercially driven. They've done a much better job in terms of how do you monetize long form content. And we're seeing each other experiment similarly across these lines as well, where we're seeing TikTok introduce the top 2% get to share 50% and trying to commercialize more. And vice versa, we're seeing YouTubers and other platforms deploy sort of more technology and recommendations and algos, which are different from the long form to the short form. So these two things are happening in parallel, which I find is like super interesting. So they're both testing each other's playing grounds, if you will. And then at the same time, if you superimpose on that, we're seeing like East and West. And I would argue that sort of the West way of monetizing sort of online content or sort of short form content is much more ads driven. So there's an ads business that powers a lot of that content, whether it's Snap, Facebook, YouTube, a plethora of more Western sort of content. The East, however, I would argue deploys a different model. They're much more hinged around fandom, and they're much more centered around sort of direct commerce. So rather than go super wide, it's about identifying super fans and allowing them to tip or to promote or to sort of pay extra for badges or for surfacing. Same is true in terms of commerce, like certain specific days in China, you sell goods for tens of billions because if you drive the commerce through online individuals and personnel selling stuff as opposed to sort of catering to lots of ads. But then again, you're seeing the East experiment with West and the West experiment with East. I think Twitch is a great example of like fandom, how they're trying to do that as well. And so these are the big trends that I see.
But do you think the transformation is happening by itself, or it depends on the age group consuming the content? For example, YouTube content, which is 1 hour long, is catered for millennials, and TikTok and other short form videos, reels, and shorts are for Generation Z who do not have much time to sit for an hour watching something. So, do you agree with that?
I think that's one way of phrasing it. I think typically how we tend to think about it is much more creator centric. So there are very few content creators who see themselves as TikTokers or YouTubers. They see themselves as content creators and they want to connect with their audiences regardless of what platform. And so I think that different platforms have different features. You may want to use the search algos through YouTube as an index where you keep a lot of your content. You may want to use Facebook to reach like your parents' friends if you want to showcase stuff. You may want to use TikTok to market your things. And I think different platforms serve different purposes for different content creators. So I wouldn't split it so aggressively across age groups, more about the job to be done and how different feature sets and different superpowers of different platforms can allow you to achieve different goals in your creative process. So I think it's much more less age-oriented and less platform-specific, and more about putting yourself in the shoes of a content creator and how you reach the largest possible audience globally.
Yes, and speaking about creators, I think creators would need guidance, and that's something that Professor Joost is doing at NYU Stern School of Business. You're currently advising publicly traded firms and startups in interactive entertainment, and of course, and also when the pandemic hit, consumers of all ages turned to digital media platforms, including streaming services and online gaming.
Mhm.
So, how streaming videos and game related content reacted to this sudden change, if I may say?
Right, right. It's I appreciate that question. I think it's a field that I've been studying for a long time, and for most of it, very few people, whether academic or investors, have spent any time on it because gaming was always on the fringes of the entertainment market. During the pandemic, I think we had this moment where, after 15 years of digitalization, where gaming became mobile, gaming became free to play, and it just went through a series of transitions during the pandemic while everybody was sitting at home staring their family in the face saying, okay, I got to find something else to do now. They turned to games to not just escape, as we like to think about it, as a form of escapism, but to find others online in these connected worlds. And so the transition that a lot of the game companies have made, and I think the awareness that's growing now, is that playing and games are just the excuse for people to hang out, right? And in a moment when we can't physically leave our house, we find a new form of connecting with others and expressing ourselves. And so the success of companies like Roblox, games like Fortnite, they all benefited, of course, from the pandemic, but they have been slowly building up these large-scale communities where we share and socialize. And for much of what we've heard so far today, there's this distinct issue where digitalization in all forms of entertainment means that we end up with this just enormous amount of content, and then these very confused consumers on the other end, right? Like, yes, the audience has grown, the overall pie has grown. At the same time, it's very difficult to connect the right content with the right consumers. And what you find is that people use references, they use their social networks, they use their connections with others to kind of navigate this space. And what's so interesting to me in all this is that as we all, of course, consume digital media and content, at the same time, we also are instilled with this sense of, well, we need to have a sense of agency. Like, we need to make decisions, we need to have a profile. Every major platform nowadays helps you narrow down the options, saying, if you like this, then you will also like that. And learning to navigate this incredibly dense, overwhelming media environment, I think that is one of the key differentiators from everything that's come before. And I think much of what we heard today speaks to that as well.
Did the games compete with TV or streaming TV?
Oh, absolutely. So streaming and gaming, I should clarify up front. In my world, that means things like Twitch, where it befuddles a lot of people to say, why would you want to watch somebody else on the internet play video games, right? But so that is the core form in the interactive space. Then there's, of course, video streaming in the sense of Netflix and HBO Max and all these other platforms. And then there is conventional broadcast television and cable TV. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think that they are, in effect, and Reed Hastings from Netflix, he said it best when asked about HBO and whether or not that was going to be a big threat. He said, well, I'm not worried about HBO as much as I worry about Fortnite, right? Because that is where my audience is going. And subsequently, you start seeing these major conventional media companies. In my world, Netflix is, sure, it's a streaming video business, but it's still very conventional in most of its production and investments. It ends up being a company that competes over attention with a very different format, and they start to lean into it. And so they start making acquisitions and investments in the game space. The same thing with Amazon, the same thing with Microsoft, of course, with all of its acquisitions over the last few years. So in many ways, these huge firms, they start to then pay attention to it. And it's initially competition, but over time, I think they start to collaborate and connect the tissue under their platform umbrella.
Yeah. So I think back again to John. John, you've worked with the companies and helped them tell their stories through transformative technology to maximize the creative impact. And now, new trends and digital production have made entertainment more accessible and attainable, especially the human imagination. How do you see the cost of such technical and digital development on the industry?
Well, I think, and as my colleagues, we're all circling around the notion of what is the new notion of a creator, or the expanding notion of a creator, right? The who can create, and the access to tools has blossomed. I love that, the 10 years, what 10 years has done to us. The access to tools has blossomed. And the fidelity that an individual can create with tools has also just exploded. It is, what I find is I struggle, in the industry, you typically try to bucket and classify people. And I struggle with that because I know individuals who are using the top end pro tools, making amazing content as an individual. And they're a professional, and they're getting paid, but they're just one person. They're not a company. And then, so it's fascinating to see the kinds of things that can be done. I think, the larger companies, what they can do is do it at scale. I know that one individual who's making amazing content, and again, he's using all the pro tools, but he's like, it takes me forever to get an episode out because he is the pipeline. He is the production entity. So the pace as to which creating content is interesting, because then scale starts coming into that, and how do you do that? Because the beast that is the consumer is consuming so much, the demand for that content goes quite high, and the demand to keep it fresh. And binge watching has been fantastic, except somebody can burn through an entire season of episodes and then go, now what do you got for me? And the problem as creators, and then this is steering away from, say, the cost, but I say the problem for creators is, if you binge watch my entire series and then move on to something else, I've got to get you back to me. I've got to get you back to my content. And so that pace and that's the challenge. Costs, I mean, tools, you can go get an Unreal Engine for free today, and start creating with it. A lot of these tools, Blender, amazing tool for free. A lot of the open source tools are being supported, and have a robust community around them for content creation. So the cost is maybe the human cost of how do you keep up with that and feed the beast while making sure you can put food on the table. Is what you're making returning enough revenue to justify the time, effort, potential cost of the tools into that.
Can I add something?
Yeah, of course. I
mean, we talked about short format and long format, and when we touched the area of binge watching. I think this is more of a statement and a question at the same time. I'm quite curious about, because when I want to binge watch something, I have to kind of invest a lot of time on Netflix. So it's a quite big threshold for me to start watching something on Netflix. But when it comes to TikTok in short format, what I think is quite interesting is that I think I'm not going to invest a lot of time, but while I open the app, I end up, at least me, and I looked at the numbers, the average 15-year-old spends 85 minutes per day on TikTok, that you end up spending over an hour plus there. And I don't know exactly, maybe Oscar has some information about this. Is it psychological? Is it the music? Because something captures me and I just get stuck on these TikTok videos, and I don't know why. I feel stupid because I watch a lot of stupid videos there. And I'm asking myself while I'm watching it, why am I watching this? And I actually finish watching it. Maybe you guys have the
because
answer.
it's an easy content.
I guess it's easy to digest.
I'm curious to hear what Joost has to say on this, because I think this touches upon what you speak about, but I think it ultimately ties back to the speed with which you can close feedback loops. So there's an element of like instant gratification, which is super powered by tools and sort of algos and sort of an accumulated huge amount of data. Like we work with music, and so we're sometimes sort of asked if we're a marketplace, and there's a distinction between music and sort of pictures, because music, you need to invest a fairly long amount of time before you can distinguish whether or not you like a track. Whereas a picture, and in some cases TikTok videos, there's like a very short time frame whether or not you like something or you don't, and you can indicate by sort of scrolling up or down if you like it or don't. So the feedback loop is incredibly short. So in the span of like 15-20 seconds, you've told the system very clearly what you appreciate to watch and what you don't watch, and they can immediately start to iterate and improve that. So I think sort of the length of the feedback loop sort of is incredibly important, sort of dynamic to explain why that's been successful. But sort of then again, I don't know if you have a sort of different take on it.
And Arash, since you've mentioned binge watching, and you've also mentioned artificial intelligence that is now working to increase the viewers' time spent watching by reducing the time the users spend searching for the desired content. So catering for the customer viewing experience and having all the technological advancement needed for even determining the emotional impact of content on viewers. How do you see that? Do you think now the digital entertainment industry has a full control over the audience needs?
I mean, AI help us get new metrics and new data points for content. Before we had to tag everything manually. Now we know the most dominant emotion in the video. AI can really predict a lot of amazing data. And I do believe that I think this is what TikTok does very well. Just going back to what Oscar said, and I'm really curious to hear what Joost have to say about this, is that I can maybe compare it to mobile gaming somehow. It feels very, very addictive. It feels very, very much like it's dragging me in because it knows me very well. The tune is perfectly right. So I think the industry is getting there, but it's interesting to see that the content creators that are the smaller ones seems to understand this more on smaller platforms like TikTok and YouTube versus the bigger ones like the Disneys and the HBOs out there that are still utilizing traditional ways of understanding the viewers. So I do definitely believe that, AI can predict so much amazing data now. So I think the power is out there. It's about who utilizes it.
So is it easier to predict when you're using TikTok or YouTube or Instagram is it easier than when you're consuming content on TV?
Yeah, it's hard to say one dominant emotion on a 2-hour movie, but on a 15-second video, you have a very clear emotion. It either makes you happy, it makes you sad. The music plays a big role in that, the video. And what I think is interesting, TikTok understands my pattern. It gives me somehow a couple of joyful videos, but then it kind of brings me down a little bit with a sad video about rescuing a puppy. And then it brings me back up again. While Netflix, while I watch a comedy, they just keep feeding me comedies. And this is, I think, where the big difference is. I'm not sure if TikTok does that, but it feels like they do that.
So let me jump on this here and say, it's my duty as an academic to kind of broaden the conversation. Say, look, Oscar mentioned the printing press earlier. Like if we take a step back, right, and look somewhat critically at all this technology, so often do we get enamored, or we totally fear these new technologies. I think personally, AI is an incredible tool to make, mass volume more digestible and gives deep insights. That's where I built my own businesses as well to some degree. At the same time, of course, there is also a growing skepticism around like, okay, well, as I'm being led through one emotion to the next and these like little bits of media consumption, we've used words like addictive already in this context. Like, is that good? Is that what we want our children to do? Is that what we want to spend our time? Is that really a medium that's eventually going to help us, have a better democratic dialogue? And what does that do? We've seen some of the output that creates in election results in countries like the US. And it's like you wonder to what degree is all this technology good or bad? And that's one conversation. But more broadly speaking, we've had these conversations for generations. Like the TV, when it first came out, was this unique thing where we could all watch the same thing together. We could learn about the news in the 1950s, 1960s. The film industry hated it because it wasn't these massive productions, and it was too short form, and it's very plebeian, it's very sort of peasant level like experience. But also TV was going to pipe university professors into the homes of all these people that couldn't afford to go to colleges, and so now we could educate the masses, blah blah blah. And so you have both that dichotomy there as well, 50, 60, 70 years ago. And you can go back centuries and you'll have the same conversation constantly. In the context of TikTok, to make it very concrete, I would argue that people generally don't watch by the topic anymore. They watch by the hour, as they would say in the conventional media scholarship. And so, you come home from work, you sit down, and that's when you do your hour of doom scrolling on whatever your preferred platform is. And then you move on because now your kid needs to go to bed, you have to do your dishes, you got to do something else. So I think it's always interesting to see how navigating this space, but also framing it into a larger set of existing consumptive, like people will do these things repeatedly, regardless of how fancy the new technology is. And it's always interesting to ask that Jeff Bezos question, like, okay, well, all this is different, but what stays the same? And I think that's a very fruitful way to look at it.
Thank you for this one. I want to go back to Oscar because you talked about creator-driven digital entertainment. How is that transforming how people consume and engage with content?
So I'd love to put that in the context of like two statements. One is the death of compromise, and one is the power of halo effects. And so I think that sort of traveling back in time, as a communicator, you'd have to compromise when you wanted to reach a huge audience. Let's use the Super Bowl as an example, right? It's this one occasion to reach tens of millions of Americans. And so you want to try and strike a balance, find something which is appealing for everyone, but offensive for no one. And you strike all these different compromises to come up with something which is interesting enough, right? So it's a horse designed by a committee is like a donkey, right? So it's somewhere in the middle. And I would argue that that compromise has died, right? Because now we're in a position where you can hyper-target like 50 different sub-segments of prospective customers, and you can tailor your message, your music, your positioning, like the different references you use, because you can reach them digitally. So it's no longer one audience of 10 million, but sort of there's like 10 audience of 100,000 or like 1,000 of 1,000, right? So compromise is no longer something that you need to abide by. And then you sort of marry that with the halo effect. Like I'm a huge Ryan Reynolds fan, right? And so as soon as I would see his name tied to any film, I know what I'm getting, what kind of humor, what kind of slapstick, what kind of level of violence, like how the narrative is going to go. And I love that. So I bring this up as a counterpoint to Joost and to Arash. When we talk about the power of AI and technology, I'd like to pin this back on the creator, because when you don't have to compromise and you suddenly have a plethora of like Ryan Reynolds, Hugh Jackman, another example, but now we have tens of millions of content creators. So we work with the Mr. Beasts and the like. And so when our music gets put into a video by Mr. Beast, it reaches 70 million people. And he is like a beacon of choice. He has a halo effect saying that this is me and I endorse this kind of music or this content. That drives listeners to Spotify and to other platforms. So I would argue that for a content creator, because you don't have to compromise anymore, because there are so many different outlets, so many millions of different content creators, and you can use that halo effect to drive discovery, consumption, shift to new platforms. I think that individuals and content creators have a huge role to play in the sort of ever so sort of AI and tech-centric sort of discussions that we typically tend to have.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and speaking of users and how they transform everything and drive major changes in the industry, Professor Joost, you have published a book called One Up: Creativity, Competition, and the Global Business of Video Games. And gaming used to be an individual experience, but it now has become a social experience. And we as people and companies are becoming more accelerated into this digital experiment. How's that changing the strategies of gaming companies?
That's an excellent question. It's something that they are currently figuring out. You see it if you look at the stock market, like the big companies like Electronic Arts, Ubisoft, Take-Two Interactive, and Activision Blizzard. Those used to be and continue to be the legacy publishers in the world. They struggle with this question, right? They transitioned from effectively a product-based model where you would build for 5 years this amazing game and then ship it and hope to sell as many copies as possible, transitioning that whole business into a service-based revenue model where you launch something and then over time you iterate and expand and you grow your community and you have specials once a week and there's all these other things that you can do. But that's a life services-based business, and that's very different than one and done and then we do another one in 5 years. They've just figured that out. So now you see most of the major companies with an 80% revenue coming from digital channels. And then they realize, well, because of the pandemic, effectively, that people go online just to hang out with their friends, right? Fortnite isn't really so much about the game anymore, as much as it is this, and I hate to say the M word, but it's sort of this metaverse place where we go to, it's a whole thing. I know, I'm sorry. I work with Matt Ball. It's like, I try not to do it, but every time I have to give him $1. Anyways, but it's the point of all this is, like, as I mentioned before, like people play games just for the sake of hanging out with others, right? We go to sports events for the same reasons. Like effectively the informational value of seeing one team score versus another, like, is very little, but it's the experience of being all dressed the same way and screaming at your favorite team on the field. That's what you go for. So these online experiences are what's next. And I don't believe that the major game companies have a solid answer to that just yet.
Yeah, and interesting. And since we only have like 7 minutes left or something, I would like to end with a question that all of us would answer. It's more of a future outlook. If we're having this exact panel discussion next year, what important or new trend we will be talking about? Like, in 2020 we all discovered TikTok, and this year we have the metaverse. So what do you think we will be having next year? What we will be seeing new acquisitions or maybe new platforms? So let's start with John.
I was going to say the first thing that I desperately want to point out is that this year, this year there was the buzz of something that people call the metaverse, right? And a lot of us in the industry and working on these things kind of went, because it's not one of those things that, I've been asked the question of when will it launch? Exactly. And I think it's the mainstream attaching a phrase to something that has been going on and evolving for a long time. And I think what's fascinating is the pace of what we're looking at and going. And again, that 10-year like is fantastic. What has happened to us and transformed to us because of a global pandemic, the amount of presentations and connections that I've had doing this video connection, it's the tangible aspect. I don't know the last time I did an audio conference call. I've only connected with people that I can see their expressions, I can see their faces. And that, to me, that pace of transformation of human connection around the world where we really are, at least being able to connect more like this is going to be fascinating. And yes, part of that thing we call the metaverse. I like the M word. I use the M word more. I say the M word because it's just what we're doing. So I think that to me is we get together next year, we're going to be marveling at just how much more this has evolved. We talk about the AI tools. We talk about this, like I have a blurred background because nobody wants to see my dirty office, right? The subtle enhancements to things like this. It's, the moment where I appear on video and I didn't shave, and luckily none of my other colleagues shaved, but they have much better beards. The moment where I want to appear clean shaven, but I'm not, right? It's like, those are the kind of interesting things that are going to be subtle, but are on that path of transformation.
Yeah,
That's
Arash,
right.
what do you think we will be talking about next year?
Yeah, I would definitely say collaboration abroad. I mean, I'm not afraid of the metaverse. I'm a designer. I work with 3D modeling, for example. And for me to 3D model with a VR headset versus a keyboard and a mouse, it's two totally different worlds. So I see a tool that can really enable creators out there to make better 3D models for their games. They can do much more creative stuff, collaborative abroad. And I think this is just a seed of what it can be. I don't believe the metaverse will enable us quickly to become friends online in this. It's more about the tools we can get with virtual reality and metaverse. And then we have the other tools that will be so we can actually edit videos abroad and we don't need to sit in the same studio. We can make music together abroad. So the creation will become much more interesting because suddenly now we have access to so many other collaborators together with us, no matter what country they're sitting in. And that will create much more culturally open content. A person sitting in South Korea is creating a movie together with a guy sitting in Sweden, for example. This was not we were not able to do this before. So I think this will be done.
Yeah, and Oscar, what do you think?
So I have a very clear prediction. I think that in a year from now, we're going to be talking less about the role for digital entertainment as recreation, and much more about the role of digital entertainment as a productivity enhancer. I think that sort of, if there's one thing that I anticipate next year, I think it's the role of digital content and how it can help accelerate, enhance, better up like productivity. And by productivity, I mean how you onboard sales reps, how you take care of customer service, how teachers teach, how you do sessions. There's a sort of incredible belief of the power. Every reference we've had here so far is about digital content being used as entertainment with no like actual learning. It's like recreational. We call it doom scrolling. I think like in a few years from now, that's going to be not an anomaly, but that's going to be a small part of the value creation of the actual business, which is sort of helping companies like really express themselves and connect with all of their stakeholders, customers, employees, regulators. Like it's all moving to video. Like the feed that I was born into, sort of the social feed, was a sort of dead text-oriented sort of endless scroll. This is now much more richer video, music, empowered, sort of immersive place. And I think that the role that can play to increase productivity in our work is going to be much more centered than
Thank you. I would like to hear from Professor Joost because we're running out of time. Do you agree with that?
I have to agree with Oscar. I think that what so often we see is entertainment and games and music and film are those onboarding categories that eventually lead to a much bigger, more of a B2B type of approach. And so, we like to talk about the iPhone being, of course, a telephone, and you can play Angry Birds, but it also connects all these people. And all of a sudden, all these companies have their apps ready, and now I can track my health and I can order my groceries. And, but ordering groceries is not sexy enough to really sell on the phone. Like nobody wants to buy a phone for that reason, but we use it, and that's where most of the money goes. Which brings me to my 10-second thought on this, which is, we'll be talking about the metaverse in the same way that we used to talk about this information superhighway, only to find, of course, that it's lots of smaller things. And so next year, we'll be talking about the bits and pieces, kind of to Oscar's point, but also to the other comments where, we take, it's not going to all develop
Thank
at the
you.
same pace,
Yeah,
and consequently, that will be the conversation next time.
Yeah, I have to just use this time to thank you all, Professor Joost, John, Arash, and Oscar. That was an interesting discussion. We've learned a lot today. Thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to next year's forum where we talk about all of this again. Thank you.
Thank you,
all.
Doaa.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.